Hello and welcome to another video. So today we're going to be taking a look at one of the Contender Cup top decks. This was of course Crumsion's top 3 finisher deck. It was a fairly decent Portal deck, honestly, looking at it. It's of course mostly artifact based, which isn't a big surprise. Most people looking for consistency are going to go for the more artifact based decks in the current kind of metas because it can be quite aggressive and deal a lot of damage. It also runs quite a decent clear and buff engine, running 1 Omen of Craving and 1 Manga Legacy, which are pretty decent as one-ofs, as you do sometimes need those to really finish off a game or just to clean up a potential board. So in a tournament setting, I can see why he was running these cards in particular, especially having to deal with decks like Blood and Sword. In particular, Sword, this deck I think has the better matchup against, as you're going to see in this video, and that tends to be where you'll probably scoop up most of your wins. And with the current meta on ladder, it's definitely not too bad. Not the most consistent I've played so far, but I haven't done a lot of testing. I'm sure Crumsion had done an absolute massive amount of testing before Contenders Cup to really get this deck to where he wanted it, so it's no surprise that he did pretty well overall with his whole lineup. Of course, also taking a pretty standard Blood deck, and I'm pretty sure a Sword deck Crumsion, so definitely impressive. So we're going to get right into it and check it out. And first up, okay, we're up against Sword, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is definitely one of the better matchups for this deck overall. It will take a little bit of getting used to, and your win con won't always be clear, but it's definitely a pretty solid deck. Overall, you're really just looking for anything you can get aggressive in the early game, at least from my experience. Other players will probably have different experience, but typically I like to go on the more aggressive curve against Sword in the early game to kind of scoop up the mid game. And of course, getting Deus Ex Machina early definitely helps you out. Definitely not a mandatory option in this deck. You can definitely win without it, but if your game ends up being dragged out, it's a card that you definitely want to have options open to. Also, setting up for a turn 2 Miriam, I always find, is a nice way to go. Hamlin is also typically better to keep when you can use it on a low cost follower, but due to our situation we weren't able to use it in the way I would have liked, so using it this way wasn't always that bad. Now we get to deal with this 2-3 pretty nicely, substitution. Definitely not your traditional mid-sword deck with versing, but definitely running a very similar engine overall. Oh, that one's actually a little more interesting. Definitely not the deck that I've seen. So it's definitely nice to see something completely out of left field sometimes, and looks like we're going to go for a pretty nice Miriam again. This time for a draw and a nice mechanization. Typically I will take Analyzing Artifacts and Radiant, as I usually like to stack the deck with some Radiants as extra finishers, and typically that's the best way to go for your finishers with Radiant Artifact. And Analyzing is a good way to go for draw power and works really nice with acceleration, but I do occasionally go for wards in the case of a dragon matchup, or rushes in the case of a blood matchup, as typically I want to be more aggressive.
Revealing your riches, eh?
But then it also depends on if I have something like Accelerating in hand, in which case Analyzing is usually straight up the better play. So a nice Deus Ex Machina is going to kill off this massive drop. It's going to do quite nicely against this.
Restore order to this world.
And we can pretty much hold off now. We don't need to play out anything, and our current hit is actually pretty nice. And there goes their last evolve point, so definitely the best thing to happen to us. We definitely like them losing them. Steadfast Angel. Definitely a nice ward. I can see it being good in blood matchups. It's the main reason I would run that card, as it's a super aggressive turn 1 play. Not quite as aggressive as Goblin, but aggressive enough. But a puppet is going to scoop that up. We can go for our mechanization again. Similar line of play, Analyzing and Radiant Artifacts, and then just kind of go face. Especially since we're now pretty much set up as far as our board goes.
Beautifully.
March on!
So the Sermon of Usurping is definitely quite a strong card. The fact that it buffs is definitely the most impressive thing about it. Being able to pretty much negate any 1-drop 1-1 kind of play, or any 1 attack follower in general, is super effective. So now we're going to pretty much clean this up, basically for free at this point, which is why I went for the Radiant first. So completely cleaning up this board. Not even having to worry about the 5-1 here using this puppet. And we also had our couple of meta productions, which would have been fine, but our opponent concedes, obviously realizing they can't keep up with that kind of flood. And for our next game, we're up against Dragon. So this is another matchup that I found this deck does reasonably well against. Obviously not exceptionally, there's definitely some downsides if you don't get the right draws, and probably dropping Entity here was a bad choice, but I went with it anyway. Learning the deck is definitely something that will take a little bit of time. It's been quite a while since I've played Shadowverse in general, actually. As of making this video, I've taken a little bit of a break over the last weekend or so, getting back into it fresh with this video. But Contenders Cup was definitely an interesting one, where I've actually got Crimson's Bat deck we'll be covering next video as well, and that's probably all I'll cover from Contenders, as the couple other decks I would like to cover, I unfortunately don't have the cards for, and don't really want to make any big adjustments to. And as far as the other decks go, most people are running Blood in pretty much every lineup, and they're all pretty much the same Blood, very minor differences. And other than that, it was mostly Sword, Dragon, and that was pretty much it. There was a few shadows placed around, Portal, things like that, but nothing super crazy. As far as Sword goes, if you've seen my janky mid-sword deck in last video and the video a few days ago, then you'll understand that Sword is pretty powerful, pretty much no matter how you build it at this point. As long as you've got a pretty solid core engine, it's very easy to build a Sword deck.
Not set to its counter.
So as you can see here, even without Deus Ex Machina, this deck does quite well at just purely building up a board and flooding.
The sharpest shot.
And we decide to obviously completely clean this out. No reason to leave it up. Our opponent can't really do too much that'd be too much of a threat to us.
Rescuing people's a hobby of
Roy,
mine.
not really an issue.
Dragon Life Blade.
Embrace your demise.
Of course, the ramp kind of sucks and makes it harder to counter, but if all they're doing is attacking like this, we're pretty much set. Especially with that Hamlin play.
On a musical journey.
I'll be your peace.
So we're going for the Miriam, putting a couple cards in the deck, and then going for the draw. Felt like that was the best way to take advantage of it.
What?
That way we could pretty much flood our board with cheap drops.
The flames are like a
But Prime
god
Dragon
on
Keeper kind of ruining our day a little bit, as that is going to be a tough one to remove in this deck without either drawing into Manga Legacy or just purely getting lucky. Then the Deus Ex Machina, probably a little late at this situation, but going to be enough hopefully.
Care to touch? Oh, the march goes on.
Definitely a deck I wouldn't mind testing out, a Prime Dragon Keeper build, but just haven't got around to it. I did call it Prince of Dragon Keeper in another video. It's Prime Dragon Keeper, but not really that relevant. As long as you guys get the gist of what the card is, it should normally be fine. Analyzing Artifact, Ancient Artifact, not really much more I can do since we're going to drop this hand anyway. I may as well just play those out and build up a board.
Restore order.
Throw a couple more damage to face and hopefully be able to limit what they can do to me here. There's Entity. That should be a nice one to kind of lock down any big storms from just killing us, so definitely nice that we got that on our draw. Double Prime is going to be rough, as it's going to be quite a substantial damage pull, but looks like we're pretty set. I honestly probably should have went for the 7 drop there. That would have, I think, actually gave us lethal pretty easily, so missing lethal there, completely my fault. Completely accept that. If I had have taken a little bit more time to realize that Omen of Craving was going to be lethal, probably would have noticed it. But at this point, it doesn't make a huge difference, as our opponent can only really put pressure down anyway, and best case, they clear out this board, so it's really not too big a threat. At least not yet. So a couple of Ancient Artifacts will clean this up.
There is no power.
Did you like it?
Weapons, got you go.
Nice little soldier. And we can pretty much just flood the board with Analyzing Artifacts. I was going to go for the Entity, obviously decided against that as I didn't think any too big a threats would be an issue. The only real lethal combo they would have had was a cheaper Ayaz Jahar into another cheap follower, but fortunately we did just manage to win. Of course, as I mentioned, if I hadn't have misplayed the earlier turns, I would have actually had lethal there pretty easily, so definitely you can see why it's quite good. So this deck definitely does fairly well on ladder at the moment. It seems to keep itself up pretty well. Of course, running into blood matchups can be a little difficult if you don't get entity pretty much on curve, but mainly you're looking, I think, at targeting those sword matchups. At least from my experience, that seems to be the best way to go. Dragon matchups can be good to average. Of course, the Prime Dragon Keeper isn't your most standard dragon deck. You'll mostly see Storm Omen dragons more often than not, but I've found that still is a pretty close matchup and really just comes down to learning the deck a little bit, and I'm sure if I spent a little more time with this deck I could get fairly decent with it and get pretty consistent results. It's definitely not a deck that you can just go in and hammer out. It definitely takes just a little bit of time to get used to. So if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe. You'll find the deck list in the description below, and a big congratulations to obviously Potwasher, Crumsion, and I've completely blanked on the third guy, but I'm sure I'll remember by next video. Either way, they're all going to contenders. If you want to check all that out, of course, make sure to follow the Sly Games Esports. Definitely going to have a lot of interesting stuff going forward with Worlds at the end of the year, so hopefully that'll be pretty cool. Otherwise, until next time, see ya.